Empress, the motherline, mommy issues, and matriarchy. Content warning. I am going to be talking about motherhood and death. I am also going to be speaking fairly broadly about fertility, motherhood, and mothering. Motherhood is not restricted only to women, but the language I use at times may sound binary. Unfortunately, the English language is more rigid than our humanity. Every single human being was gestated in a womb. Whether you were in your mother's, father's, or parents' womb, it was a womb nonetheless. If you were conceived through intercourse, a scientific procedure like intrauterine insemination or in vitro fertilization, or if you were carried by a surrogate, you were still warmed, fed, and cared for in the safety of a uterus. Although the womb is our first home in this world, it is also a topic of great controversy. While it may feel like the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the United States was the most politically charged act against wombs we have lived through, it is not new for the divine magic of motherhood to be politicized. In fact, one could argue, like I did in a paper this spring, that this is simply a new chapter in the centuries-old tradition of witch hunting. And I don't mean the perceived witch hunts that we hear American fascists call accountability. I mean the act of patriarchal systems targeting and killing women for holding sacred power. Enter the Empress. She is all things divine feminine. She is a mother, she is a daughter, she is a sister, and she is a cool aunt. Often depicted pregnant and reclining, she originally stood for fertility because empires would fall if an empress did not birth an heir. But as Pamela Coleman Smith and other scholars depict her now, she is a symbol of the magical womb. But motherhood is a fairly complicated topic. Anyone who looks at social media on Mother's Day will see that while there is a barrage of nice photos of nice people with their nice moms, there are just as many memes and posts about how difficult and painful the Hallmark-created holiday can be. Fertility issues, miscarriages, abusive moms, deceased mothers, and more can influence your relationship to motherhood. And some of us have a little potpourri of all of the above. In my first semester at CIIS, I read Naomi Ruth Lewinsky's book, The Motherline. Lewinsky is a Jungian psychologist and presents an ethnographic study on ways to trace your lineage through the women on all sides of your family. She examines her own role as a mother, her mother and grandmother's parenting, and speaks with several mothers and daughters who reflect on the vast intricacies of this sacred maternal connection we all have. Again, maternal being used regardless and inclusive of gender. It is my feeling that this book is what sent my health careening over the edge into a divine sickness that lasted for months and stirred up my relationship to the goddess and to my mother's spirit. In October of 2023, I had to read The Motherline for a huge project that is a rite of passage in the Women's Spirituality program at CIIS for a class called Sacred Lineages, Goddesses, Foremothers, and Activists. The Motherline project involves scholars reading through one of 3 Motherline texts, Lewinsky's being one of them, and then researching their own Motherline, presenting the research in class, and writing a final paper on what they found. For me, this task was deeply overwhelming. When I was a child, there was no one in the world whom I loved more than my mother. She was the person I spent the majority of my time with, not just because I loved her, but because I was also homeschooled by her, and she was a proud full-time wife and mother. We would do experiments and crafts together. We would go to the mall together. We would watch TV and movies, and we always had so much fun. The one time in my life that I have used a Ouija board was with her. We asked all kinds of questions, but the one I remember the most was when my mother asked, Are Anna and I true blue best friends? And the planchette raced over to say yes. The only times we didn't have as much fun were when we fought, and we could fight incredibly hard. I'm sure that I will expand upon what we fought about in other posts, so I won't get too deep into it here. What is most important to know about my mother was that she had a great deal of untreated trauma that she chose to self-medicate. I know that now, and while it does not mend the shredded relationship we had when she passed away in 2019, it does inform how I speak with her spirit and reflect on our relationship. When my mother passed away, I utterly collapsed. I didn't feel like there was a point to anything anymore if she wasn't there to please. Why keep working if her impossible standards could no longer be met? Why try to have children if she wouldn't be there to teach me and probably judge my parenting? Even with these complex narratives in my deepest sorrow, I couldn't see how much harm she had caused me in our time together. However, right before the 2020 COVID-19 lockdown, I got medicated for depression for the first time and actually began to properly grieve and heal. I was one of the few people who was grateful for the solitude so that I could process this great trauma that had occurred in my life. My grief was incredibly angry for quite some time. I was mad at her for leaving. I was mad at her for not taking better care of herself. I was mad at her for gifting me her trauma. I was mad at her for absolutely everything I could be mad at her for. And the anger lasted a lot longer than I would have ever assumed or intended. But over the years, the anger has finally begun to soften. And I believe that the work I did for the Motherline Project is part of it. While reading about Demeter and Persephone and goddesses from all throughout the world who represent mothers and daughters over millennia, I started to realize that part of what makes my mother and my story special is that it is not unique. All mothers and daughters fight and grapple with power dynamics, and every pair approaches it differently. I couldn't be properly angry with her while she was on the planet, but I can be now, and processing that anger has aided my grief. Which brings me back to what happened while working on my Motherline project. On my 37th birthday, in one of my favorite places on Earth, I got a urinary tract infection. I had just had one the month before, both falling on the full moons of their respective months, and neither time made any sense as to why it was happening. I am meticulous with my hygiene because my earliest memories are tainted by UTIs. When I was about 2 or 3 years old, I would get, quote, stinging pee-pee. I wouldn't want to urinate because it hurt so badly. But my parents would try to give me lots of fluids so that I could flush out the infection. Unfortunately, there is nothing more stubborn than a little Scorpio girl who is avoiding being in pain. Eventually, I had to go to Children's Hospital in Oakland to see why these infections kept happening. I was catheterized for the procedure, and I can still feel my hot tears dripping into my ears as the doctors tried to figure out what, if anything, was wrong with my urethra. Apparently, there was nothing wrong with me. It was simply a case of growing up in a Victorian home that only had a clawfoot bathtub and no shower. And now, here I was on the one day of the year that I am supposed to be celebrated and happy, and instead I was in my hotel bed with a fever and chills, trying not to get orange dye from the urinary pain reliever on the hotel bed's white sheets. I kept getting birthday texts saying, "I hope you have the best day ever," or "I don't know what you're up to today, but I hope it's wonderful." I would just respond, "Thank you." No need to bum out my friends and loved ones with the truth. While I did recover from this infection, my urinary tract has not been the same since. I have had an ultrasound and a consultation with a urologist, but I truly believe that my connection to my womb and the divine feminine and my mother's spirit were what needed to be grappled with to feel better. I have been working on caring for my health the way that my mother would want me to, and I've been asking her spirit for advice. I've been finding ways to worship and free my reproductive system, and the Empress has been a huge part of that. The Motherline presentation and paper went well. For my presentation, I hosted a ghost dinner party and introduced all the women in my mother line with the specialties that they cooked and contributed to the menu. For my paper, I talked about Demeter and Persephone and the role that grief played in my mother and my relationship. I don't feel that my work with the Empress is over or even at a crest. This is a lifelong commitment to my own divinity and the ways that we can learn to access it from the inside out. I hope that this scattered essay may serve as a ritual tool of healing to you and your own mother wound. And so it is. Postscript. After finishing this piece and letting it sit for a day or two to be sure I liked where it ended up, I had my first mild UTI for the first time since February. It is currently mid-May. I'm not sure what it means, except maybe just my mom not wanting me to share any of this publicly, but I am working through this message, and I am grateful to have you all with me. Bright blessings to you all.